Is food produced through bacterial fermentation permissible? Is food produced through bacterial fermentation permissible? Now, I have answered a similar question to this on Seeker's Guidance Answer Service, particularly about fermented cocoa, right? Is fermented cocoa or chocolate permissible? The answer is basically as follows. While fermentation is a ubiquitous process and fermented food tends to be healthy and good for your body, one of the byproducts that is often that often comes from this process is in fact ethanol. It's a byproduct that might stem off from the fermentation process. So does this mean that fermented foods are intrinsically unlawful because of the minute amounts of, or the trace amounts of alcohol that are there? So according to what we've found is that the traces of ethanol produced by the fermentation process, they are so minute that they barely register when measured, right? They barely register. For the most part, sophisticated scientific material or instruments could likely show that there's the presence of ethanol, but that's just about it. To demonstrate that they barely register, one would notice that on the food labeling, which has to follow certain requirements, that if there's a certain percentage, a very small percentage of an element in the food, it needs to be stated. So these trace amounts of alcohol are so minute that they don't even register to the point where it needs to be added to the label. Under such circumstances, right, when they are so minute that they are omitted from the product labeling due to being inconsequential, this is not considered as enough to regard this otherwise permissible item as impermissible. Remember, at its core, this item is never going to intoxicate, no matter how much you consume of it. So the concept of, khamr, whatever intoxicates in a large amount is haram in a small amount. In an item such as this, it doesn't even apply because, number one, it's not khamr. And number two, we're not talking about a small amount. We're talking about an almost inconsequential amount, an amount that we cannot even discern with the naked eye in all probability. So that is the case with regards to food stuff like yogurt, pickles, and the like. Fermentation is used, but the minuscule trace amounts of ethanol, which barely register, are not considered enough to regard the item as unlawful to consume. Fermented drinks, however, when fermentation takes place within liquids or drinks specifically, then usually, from what I found, this may contain large amounts of ethanol, and this should be watched for. This is how nabidh is made. So even if it is not explicitly labeled as an alcoholic drink, right? Some liquids are fermented and they then contain enough alcohol that it needs to be added to the label. An example of this is soy sauce. So many types of soy sauce contain high amounts of ethanol as a result of the fermentation process, to the point where it is actually labeled, and therefore the consumption of soy sauce is something that often comes up as being problematic, because many, if not most, forms of soy sauce do in fact contain high quantities or amounts of ethanol, and Allah knows best. Then we need to also speak about how does this affect the Shafi'i followers. So in the Shafi'i madhab, any liquid intoxicant is not only considered haram to consume, but it's also considered najasa, it's considered filth. So according to the dominant view, the relied upon view in the Shafi'i school, najasa or ritualistic filth includes wine and any liquid intoxicant, as Imam Nawawi clearly states in all of his works. The alcohol widely used as a solvent today, or what they refer to as denat ethanol, fully denatured ethanol, basically means that they've made this ethanol unfit for human consumption. It's the same ethanol, but what they add to it is a type of toxin and pungent chemicals such as methanol, naphtha, pyridine, or bittering agents such as denatonium benzoate. I don't even know if I'm saying these chemical names correctly. However, the adding of these toxins or bittering agents doesn't remove the ability of the ethanol to intoxicate. It only adds toxicity to it so that people don't consume it deliberately. And it adds a bitter taste to it so that it's not pleasurable to consume. And as such, it remains najasa because it remains a liquid intoxicant. Now, with that said, the problem with this is the widespread usage of this type of ethanol. When we say widespread usage, we mean that it is used in products such as fruit juice, paint, ink, hand cleaners, soap, cream, dye. The clothing that you're probably wearing right now was probably dyed with a substance that has large amounts or trace amounts of ethanol therein. Now, this widespread usage of this item means that our homes, our clothes, our carpets, our fridges, anything where this ethanol exists is going to be considered mutanajjis. It is contaminated by filth, and that is not practical in the modern world. And when we have a situation like this, our scholars refer to this as umumul balwa, the affliction of the masses. Like the overwhelming majority of people will be placed into an extremely difficult situation if they were duty bound to avoid, right, alcohol or ethanol in all of its forms. So based on the principle of umumul balwa, most Shafi'i scholars would recommend that while we maintain our status quo with liquid intoxicants and we generally consider liquid intoxicants as najasa, we also understand that for the most part, the type of ethanol that is found in everything in everyday life is not going to be considered problematic in the Sharia because of umumul balwa, and we simply consider it as ma'fuun anhu, which means it is overlooked, right? It is not going to affect the validity of your prayer or your acts of worship, and it is completely overlooked because avoiding it is practically impossible, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best.
La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah.